All right, I gotta shut that off, whatever that is.
Alrighty, we will read our text together. For those watching online, our text is taken from 1 Samuel 18, 17 through 30. 1 Samuel 18, 17 through 30. I am on mine right here. Eric, am I?
Pardon? Oh.
No, I'm not just the video. I was just wondering if the video was on.
Yeah.
Okay, good,
Oh.
good. No problem.
I know you were having trouble.
No, I've got it.
My bad.
It's quite all right. All right, let's read. 1 Samuel 18, we'll begin reading verse number 17, and it reads like this. Then Saul said to David, "Here's my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me, and fight for the Lord's battles." For Saul thought, "Let my hand not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him." So David said to Saul, "Who am I, and what is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king?" But it happened at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel, the Mahalathite, as a wife. Now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. So Saul said, "I will give her to him, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." Therefore Saul said to David a second time, "You shall be my son-in-law today." And Saul commanded his servants, "Communicate with David secretly, and say, 'Look, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now therefore become the king's son-in-law.'" So Saul's servants spoke those words in the hearing of David. And David said, "Does it seem to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing I am a poor and lightly esteemed man?" And the servants of Saul told him, saying, "In this manner David spoke." Then Saul said, "Thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines, to take vengeance on the king's enemies." But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to become the king's son-in-law. Now the days had not expired. Therefore David arose and went, he and his men, and killed 200 men of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins and gave them in full count to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, as a wife. Thus Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was still more afraid of David, so Saul became David's enemy continually. Then the princes of the Philistines went out to war. And so it was, whenever they went out, that David behaved more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name became highly esteemed. All right, what about some observations? What do you see in the text tonight?
Well, Saul was trying to get rid of David by letting the Philistines kill him.
That's right. He was trying to get the easy way out.
Yeah.
And just basically putting him constantly in harm's way, so the Philistines may do the dirty work with him, because I think he was afraid of the politics of him being the one that offed David. Yes, Al.
By him giving, like offering his daughter Mara, that would give him an opportunity to keep an eye on David, to see what he did, and to see what God did with David. In either case, Saul felt there was a benefit to it. Whether he really truly wanted to give his daughters to David or not, it's scriptures don't say, but I see with Saul's temperament and his ability to be subversive, that was a good way for Saul to keep eye on David. Put him in the family so he could watch him.
That's right. I believe Saul must have been a firm believer in the old saying, "Keep your friends close and your enemies closer." And so he wanted to keep a constant eye and watch over what David was doing and how David was operating. Yes.
I know that, I remember the story with Michal being, getting after David about dancing and stuff, but I did not realize that it says here that Saul said, I'm going to give her to him, that she may be a snare to him.
Mm-hmm.
So he taunted the first daughter, to try and get him killed with the Philistines, and then gave her away. She must have been she must have been a more easygoing daughter than the second one, because that seemed to be a very motivating factor.
Yeah, and I think too that because she was the first daughter, that had more prestige, and so that must have been what motivated Saul to change his mind and to give her to another that would be more beneficial to him. He didn't mind using his family for his own benefit. Yes, Ann?
And just kind of a similarity between this and like a little bit later in the story, but like Saul was trying to indirectly kill David, but then like later on in the story, David does something similar where he tries to indirectly kill someone else.
He commits the same sin, but he succeeds in the death of a man to cover his own sin. That's for sure. The very same thing. So, so that absolutely good point, man. Any other observations?
Yeah, people think I'm sick. Well, why the foreskin? Why not the left thumb, the right thumb?
Yeah,
Why cut
yeah.
off the foreskin and bring
I
it
guess a man will have to die to
I mean, just cut the whole thing off and bring it back. Why the foreskin?
You would think so.
Because they were pagan people and they didn't
Mm-hmm.
practice circumcision. We don't know about the other tribes. But if you have this, you know that it's from a pagan.
That's right. You knew it's not Jewish people.
If you have an arm, maybe you killed your brother and took his arm off.
Mm-hmm.
Or you killed your relatives and took their arms off.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point, because it was a distinguishing factor between the pagans and the Jewish. Yes, Al.
Doing something like that would have been harder than if he would have had him say like the Indian used to scalp white people,
Mhm.
because these people were military people, and they were observant. They were careful about who they hung around with, and they didn't want to get themselves entrapped. 200 men would be hard to entrap, to do
Yes,
something
yes.
like that too.
Yes.
You would have to almost ambush them and kill them right away,
Mhm.
so none got away for reinforcements.
That's right, that's right. That was significant. That was
Yeah.
significant numbers.
It doesn't say they were all collected at one time. It could have been over the course of a,
But did he put a time limit on that?
He did. Saul
And so
did say,
David had to do something in a short
within,
period of time.
within that period of
Right,
time,
right.
yeah.
but it doesn't mean that it all happened on one day. It could have
No,
been.
no, I'm not saying that.
Right.
but I'm
A week
saying
or-
that
Could have been
the time
ambushes
frame
that took
he had,
place through-
He would have had to, and that would be a very difficult thing to do, because soldiers were scattered out all over. How do you get 200 soldiers gathered together unless there's an active battle? You just don't do it.
Yeah, it's, man, I tell you, that was amazing that he was able to have that kind of success.
Good food and
Yes.
wine.
Yeah.
And it was twice as many
But,
as he asked for.
That's right. It was twice as many as Saul had required. Saul had only required 100, but David brought back 200. Yeah. Any other observations? All right. Well, anybody remember what we talked about last week? Talk about the test of what? Success. We saw how success had become a test to David as it does in our life. How that oftentimes if God wants to see if we are fit to succeed, he'll turn around and give us a taste of that to see how we handle that kind of success. And then many people can't handle the challenges that come with success. But tonight we want to look at the flip side of that. We want to look at the test of loss. We're going to look at the test of loss as it points out here in the Word of God. Because the tide has changed for David. David is stepping into an area of his life that would be probably the longest passage of his life. Before the crowning of David. And that is a period when things begin to disintegrate in front of his eyes. He would begin to lose important things. Saul would begin to connive, and Saul would begin to strip him of certain things. Saul would begin to give to him only so that he could take from him. So Saul began to use all these devices in his life. We see the slow decline of what David once had in the household of Saul and what he has now. So let's take a look. Let's take a quick look at that. What is David's loss? What was something? And let's not. I'm not just holding you to this text, but in the very next text, we see that Saul goes after him, and David has to run for it. And we'll take a look at that next week. But what were some of the things that David lost in this season of his life?
Lost a bride.
That's right. He lost a wife. Anything else that he lost in this season? James.
In a sense, he kind of lost his freedom of movement because he went from being able to go home to his family, although I think Saul limited him anyway, saying you have to eat at my table now. But it's like Saul's trying to put his grip on David and not let him just go wherever he wants.
That's right. And you're going to see that loss of freedom even more so later, because he will become a hunted beast. He'll become a hunted man for the longest period of his life before the crowning. In this period that we're looking at here, the longest period was David on the run from Saul. That was the biggest thing. Anything else that David lost in this process? He lost the roof over his head. He lost a home. Although Saul had required that he move into the palace, we're going to see at the very first of next week that David had to run for his life. David could not run home. because that would be the first place that Saul would look. David could not run into necessarily villages. So David would end up at the cave of Adullam. He would go from being in the palace to moving to being in a cave. That's a big change, isn't it? Isn't it? Anything else that David would lose? What started this mess? Saul had killed his thousands, David his tens of thousands. Al?
Jealousy.
Yeah, jealousy did. It sure did. It sure did. And he was stirred up to do that. But one of the things that in the process David lost is he lost his praise. He lost his reputation. He would move from being the one that the women sung about to the one the women whispered about. Why? Because he would become an enemy of the state. He'd become someone that Saul would demonize, that Saul would try to make out to look bad. The bad negative press was all over David during this time. So he would lose the praise of his reputation. Can you think of anything else that David may have lost in this?
His position.
His position. That's right. He lost his position. What was that position?
Being the king's armor bearer.
Armor bearer. That's right. He was the armor bearer. He was the king's singer. Those positions. Those were positions of acclaim. Those were positions of great power.
But didn't Saul appoint him to some type of military commission, like a colonel or a general?
He actually, even as you see in here, he actually tells David, we don't know if there's a specific title, but he tells David, you're to fight for me. You're to be valiant for me. So the suggestion is that he was a military leader.
Yeah,
and I believe that.
I don't know what their ranks were back then, but I'm sure he held some type of a rank that he would have had to.
You would think so.
Yeah.
Keep in mind that Israel was a very young nation.
Right.
Militarily, he was the very first king. It may not be a ranking system as we would think of it,
But he would have probably more authority because of his relationship to the king.
Exactly.
Most any other soldier of any rank, if there was any.
That's right. That's right.
Around him.
David was technically, after his marriage to Michael, part of the royal family, and yes, that would carry some weight. So that would show some prestige too. That would show some. So there was a number of things that was being stripped away from David. There was a number of things that he was losing in the process. And as we saw last week, there are some people that can handle their Goliaths. There's some people that can handle the challenges that come against them. And then there's even those people that can handle the test of success. They don't have any problem with success. But then there becomes a big issue with many people when they have to deal with loss. Now we already know about the prosperity teachings where they believe that that God will bless you and God will give to you, and even suggest that if you're not being blessed, that you're sinful, that you're not pleasing to God, and surely those would be people that would identify this. But can I tell you, there's a lot of Christians. Not ones that believe in prosperity, but a lot of Christians that in the back of their mind, they have a personal theology that simply thinks, God will never do that to me. And when bad things happen to them, it rocks, it shakes their world. When loss happens to them, it flies in the face of their vision of God. I've heard saints that have been for decades serving the Lord and would come to me with tears in their eyes saying, why me, Pastor? There's only one answer to that. Why not you? Why not? I like what C.S. Lewis said. He said, bad things happen to Christians for a very good reason. They're the only ones equipped to face them. They're the only ones that have the capability to face them. And God will oftentimes use loss in our lives to shape us. He'll use loss in our lives to strip from us things. I noticed something here. Many of the things that that was stripped from David, God didn't give David. God gave David the victory over Goliath, but the wife Saul gave him. God turned around and anointed him and said, you would be the king, but he didn't give him the place in the palace. It was too early for that. Saul gave him a place in the palace. We have to notice that while God blessed him and touched him, God didn't cause the fame to the singing. There's no record in David's thing that he rebuked any of the women for singing praises about him. There's no record where he says, it's God that did this. So almost all of these things, most all of these things that was stripped away from him was things that God never gave him. That maybe he got on his own, or Saul gave him, or circumstances gave him. But there's times that God will strip away those things that he didn't give us, so that we might be able to see what he wants us to keep. And oftentimes, and here's a warning for you, he'll use trying relationships to do that. He'll use people to take away sometimes things from your life and from your heart that you thought was yours and you thought you could hang on to. We need to understand that. We need to embrace that in our lives. But there's a principle that I want you to understand. I want you to recognize, and today, and it's this: God is not as concerned with what is happening to you as much as what is happening in you. Now,
I'll say, one thing that God did provide for David that we're probably not looking at here is the fact the things that came against it would harm David, God blocked them out. So his life he wasn't killed or severely maimed in any way.
absolutely,
And
absolutely.
he's done that all throughout David's life, and apparently, that looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Even when David defected over and went with the Philistines, remember? And he went and slaughtered those towns.
Mm-hmm.
God still was with him.
Oh, absolutely. Now, God's blessings never completely left David. I don't want to suggest that that was the case. But God did allow David to be stripped of some things.
Right.
And that period in David's life was a very humbling period in his life. When he found himself on the run. When he found himself rejected by his own home people. When he found these things in his life. But David would come to realize something. I know it's something that David really appreciated. Is that he come to realize that God was doing a work in him. That God was shaping him and molding him. That's what this entire study is about, is how God makes a king. And so God wasn't so much concerned with making David happy. God was concerned with making David holy. God was concerned with shaping his life for what was to come in his future. So we need to remember that. That's a powerful principle for us to understand, because we don't like things happening to us, do we? We don't like it when people do bad things against us. We don't like these things in our life. But can I tell you that sometimes God is in it? Yes, Al.
Joseph was a prime example.
Absolutely.
He spent 13 years in an Egyptian prison.
Yeah.
God allowed him to get out because he had a reason for him being there.
That's right. And Job was one of the starkest realization that sometimes God allows bad things to happen in our lives, and he allows those things to work together for the good for us in the process. So we need to understand that. David, at the end of it all, David would come to realize that he would value the more important things. David would come to value that which was most precious. David would come to value what God had given him. David would come to value the principles and the teachings that God had taught him. So let's see how this goes. Let's see exactly how the loss began in David's life and how it shaped David. The very first thing I want you to notice is the lost promises. Lost promises. David had to be confronted with some promises that wasn't kept. When he was dealing with Saul, in verses 17 through 18, Saul comes to him. Saul comes to him, and the first thing that Saul does is Saul realizes that because David had taken the challenge, and he had taken the challenge of Goliath, that now is the responsibility of King Saul to give him what he was promised. What was David promised when he took down Goliath? Two things. Y'all remember what they were? What's that?
A wife.
A wife. And that was a good thing. A wife from his family. What's the second thing? You remember what the second thing was? What's that now?
Wasn't it a place at Saul's table?
Not quite. I think it was better than that. No taxes for the rest of your life. How many of you like that? How many of you like that? No taxes for the rest of your life. David, that was what David was promised, those two things. We don't hear too much mention about the other, but we do hear the mention that Saul realized he had made the promise. So Saul comes to him with the daughter that he intended to give to the champion, the eldest daughter, and he says, here she is. And David said, basically, who am I that I would that I'd be the son-in-law to the king? You see the reflection of his humility there in the way. So Saul turns around and does what? Gives her away. He breaks the promises that he had made to him. If we've ever lived for any more than a few minutes, we've experienced broken promises. We've experienced lies. We've experienced manipulations. We've experienced these things in our life. And some scholars believe that David set himself up for this. That David wanted this, and because he wanted something that God hadn't promised him, that David set himself up for his own disappointment. Notice what it said here. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah, 1 Samuel 17, that's last week we looked at. Was it week before last? Then David, he's out on the field with Goliath. Notice what it said. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine? What did David say? What's in it for me? He was already looking at what the return was on his investment. Did David kill Goliath? I don't believe he did. God killed Goliath. God just used David, but now David was stepping up to claim the spoils of this situation. So many scholars believe that the problem was that David set himself up for his own disappointment. David set himself up for the lost promises in his life. He probably already thought, this already belongs to me. This is something in our life. It shows up something very crucial that we need to realize. And I don't think any of you would disagree with this at all. Promises are only as good as the promiser. David would come to realize that the promises of Saul was stinking rotten because Saul was stinking rotten. That it was flimsy and it nothing to stand on because of where it came from. Saul knew the promises of God, on the other hand, was sure. David knew the promises of God was sure. Saul would bring to him all these promises, and David would have to learn the hard way that even a king will let you down. Can I tell you, people will let you down. People will disappoint you. Yes, Al.
When you said that, I'm thinking about us, United States, our king, that we got the White House. I mean, I don't wanna bring politics in here, but it just makes me think that.
Well, and the longer we live, the more we learn that even people that mean well for us will break their promises sometimes. That even people that are out for our good and out for our benefits. So we have to realize that. We gotta understand that even when people offer to us option B from what they promised us, like Saul would do here, is that their promises are flimsy from the very beginning, from the very foundation. If you're relying on man for your blessings, you'll be disappointed. If you're relying on people to keep their promises, you're going to be disappointed. If you're relying on that contract to hold up in court, you're going to be disappointed. Why? Because here in the Word of God, David teaches us a very, very powerful principle that promises are only as good as the promiser. David would come to realize that the only sure, firm promises that he had in his life was what God had given him. The only sure, firm promises in his life. And he could have spent his life in rage and in turmoil and in trying to fix things. But he had to come to realize that I don't have to fix them. God's given me better and greater promises that I can stand on in my life. So how do we do that? David shows us that we have to maintain our perspective. We've got to see things from the right angle and the right way. You see, we need to ask ourselves when things are going on around us and in the situations and the circumstances in our life, we got to pause and ask ourselves, what is going on in me? What is at work in me? Is God at work in me? Or is the enemy having the right of way? We need to ask ourselves, is God truly producing something in me? Because you see, that's what David was doing. David was being cheated. That's what he was. David was being lied to. David would later, you're going to see he's being manipulated. But he realized there was a few principles that he had to lay hold to in his life. David chose to embrace the vantage point of humility. When we're humble, we realize where we come from. When we're humble, we realize what we truly deserve. You know what we deserve? Nothing. We really don't. We really don't. Everything that God has given us is out of His goodness and His grace. Listen at the words of David. I like what David said here. In verse 18. After Saul had cheated him, this is what say, and turned around. So David said to Saul, "Who am I, and what is my life, or my father's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king?" It seems as if David just turned around, and in the middle of all this situation, he reminded himself of where he was and who he really was. Yes.
I was wondering here, with what we're seeing here, did he fully realize that one day he was going to be the king and he'd be the top man? Or did he really grasp the thought when Samuel poured the oil over his head and anointed him? Did he really get
That's a very good point, because this statement almost seems to fly in the face of a realization. David didn't seem to. You never hear David say, "I'm king." You never hear David announce that or promote that or anything. And some would think that that's part of the humility of David as well. And also, too, you got to realize that David was saying, "I'm not fit to be son-in-law to the king." You know, and which was not necessarily the position of king itself. Yes, sir.
What did a sheep herder look forward to? I mean, it's not one of the lowest jobs you can get.
Absolutely.
I mean, I don't know how long he herded sheep, but it was probably as early as they thought he might be responsible for the job. Which
Yes.
might have been 8, 10 years old. someplace
That's right.
in there.
That's right.
But, I mean, that's a meeting job, day in and day out.
That is.
No glory in it at all.
And now, David, if you read his Psalms, and we're gonna a little later on, we're gonna begin to inject, because he starts writing Psalms in the next chapter or so, and we're gonna line them up with these scriptures. You're gonna notice something. David understood how highly God favored humility. There's few things in your Christian walk with God that is more vitally important to God than your humility. Humility seems to be the golden characteristic to those that deal with God. And it was probably one of the things that God saw in David is this ability to be humble. When we're humble, it saves us a lot of trouble. See, when we're proud, we stand defiant, and we have to defend our name and our reputation and all these things. But when we're humble, we can shrug off a lot of the things that could bring us complete and total humiliation and offense in our life. And David seemed to, as I looked at this, I noticed something. Saul offered him the first daughter, and he says, "Who am I?" Saul offered him the second daughter, and he said, "Who am I?" It wasn't until Saul mentioned the dowry that David felt comfortable taking him up on this daughter as a wife. It seems to me that David was looking for God to confirm that this marriage was right by blessing him on the battlefield. It seems to me, because the verse, I want you to notice what the verse is in verses 25 and 26. Then Saul said, "Thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines, to take vengeance on the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines." So when his servants told David these words, it pleased him well to become the king's son-in-law. Now the days had not expired. That meant that there was yet a time limit that David had to do. But the word that jumped out to me was, and it's not because it's bold, because it wasn't in bold in my Bible. It is because it said it pleased him. It said it gave him some kind of relief to say, yes, well, we can do that. As if he was looking for God to confirm this. Have you ever asked God to confirm something that you find out later God wasn't in? That maybe God wasn't a part of? Yes, God had anointed, and he is working through David, and he's blessing through David. God was blessing him in fighting against his enemies, but I believe that had nothing to do with Michael in his life. But he was using that to confirm this in his life. But I like the perspective that David had. The perspective that David had is I still want to be in the will of God. I still want to do what God would have for me to do. So we can see that here in the Word of God. David seemed to realize what was most important, and that was the things that God had given him. David seemed to realize that in the middle of broken promises, God, he still had the promises of God, and he could rest in that, and he could trust in that. But then there's another lost thing that I want you to notice, and that's lost relationships. Who comes up next but Michael? Now, there's something very powerfully that is said here about Michael. What does it say, the very first thing about Michael? She loved David. She loved David. I think that's fine. We're going to see Michael later, next week, save David's life. We're going to see that passion and that love as she steps out to save her husband. But you see, there's a few things about Michael I want you to understand. Michael was the second choice, but Michael represents some things in our life that we need to watch out for. First thing I want you to notice is we need to beware of shallow relationships. Michael was a modern day relationship. Why do you say it's shallow, Derrick? It said she loved him. Yes, she loved him. She saved his life. Then later in her life, she was going to be given. Be given to another husband by Saul. She was going to be given away just like the first daughter was given away. And later, David would step in and reclaim Michael. And when he reclaims Michael, he brings her back to the palace. Then he brings the Ark of the Covenant down the streets of Jerusalem, dancing before it with a linen ephod. And then the Bible says that Michael looked out of the window and despised him. And when he come up upstairs, she mocked him and said, "Oh, who are you, the king of David?" And God had enough of Michael. He cursed her from that point forward. She would never have another child. She would never be, and I believe, and you don't hear anything else about Michael. So what does that tell me about Michael? That tells me that that relationship was not a real relationship. That relationship was a passion. You know, David was a handsome man. He was a good-looking man. David was a famous man at this point. Women were singing his name in the streets. What woman wouldn't want to be attached to this man, David? And Michael saw her opportunity, the second born, to step up and to be somebody in the shadow of this man, King David. But oftentimes in our life, we begin to realize that we're going to cross paths with relationships that, as I said last week, relationships that are more practical, in that people say, "What's in it for me?" This is the modern day definition of love. I hear people sit in the pastor's office all the time, and they'll say this: "I fell out of love." Really? He doesn't do this for me. He doesn't do that for me. He doesn't say this for me. He doesn't say, well, how did that become the definition of love? That's not God's definition of love. God's definition of love is unconditional love. But in our modern society, love is how somebody else makes me feel about me. It becomes revolving around me. Michael was that kind of relationship. Michael was that kind of, and sometimes God steps in and he removes those kind of relationships from our lives because he knows what it's doing to us. I believe that Michael was not so much removed by Saul, but removed by God. Because of the heart that was in Michael's. God didn't give David Michael. Saul gave David Michael. There'll be people in your life that will have a shallow relationship. You know, you'll have friends that, I've had friends where they call you and talk with you for hours about their problems. As soon as you brought up anything about yourself, oh, well, I gotta go. Because it's all about what is in it for me. So we need to realize we need to beware of shallow relationships. And as Michelle pointed out, and I noticed it too, we need to watch out for the snares. Saul said something about his daughter that no daughter wants to hear from dad. You can marry him so that you can be a trap. That's what she was saying. And this was before the dowry idea seems to have formulated. This was when she came to him and he began to think about this, and she could be a snare. Did Saul know something about his daughter that he wasn't sharing? Did Saul know the heart that was in Michael? Did Saul know the attitudes and the spirit that would later come to the surface, where she would despise David with her heart, where later she would mock the godly thing that David had done, where later she would incite God to move on her life? Watch out for the snares in our life. Snares are is toxic personalities. There are people in your life that will do you harm and will do you no good. There are persons in your life, and I believe the enemy plants them in our lives as traps to trap us in situations and circumstances. And Saul set out to ensnare David with Michael. And I believe he let it slip here by talking about what kind of person she truly was. He knew something about her. But then She was stolen away. She would be given to another man. Like I said, later when David begins to take the throne and all, he goes and lays claim to her. And said, "You're my wife." And takes her from that man. Later, and here's something that has nothing to do with anything we're talking about. But later, when it is required by that the sons of Saul and the children of Saul be turned over to the enemies, David turns over the sons of the first wife that was claimed to him. We see these interactions here. We see relationships that should have never been. We see relationships that were toxic, that was hurting them. And God tied David's hands. David didn't lose Michal. She was stolen away from him. This relationship. Now, we're not talking in the context of marriage necessarily. We're talking in the context of relationships in our life. That there's going to be relationships that God will bless us by getting us out of. We need to be able to recognize that. We need to be able to notice that. Then thirdly, I want you to notice this. There was lost trust. We begin to see next chapter that David constantly responds to David with giving him the benefit of the doubt. Constantly responds to Saul. David shows him the greatest gratitude, the greatest respect, But in the next chapter, we're going to see that not only did David, but Jonathan, the son of Saul, Michal, the daughter of Saul, they no longer trust Saul. And so the trust that he relied upon, and that he leaned upon, and that he depended upon for his safety, for his well-being, he all of a sudden lost it. Why? What brought him to that point? Well, there's a number of things that brought him to that point. First of all, he was used. We see it again and again throughout this entire process. He was being used by Saul. Saul, it was a win-win situation. If David killed the Philistines, if David got killed by the Philistines, he won either way. He would constantly be putting David in the field, constantly putting David in front of the Philistines, constantly be raising the stakes with David. He would have a dowry, which he'd say, "You're going to have to kill 100 Philistines." He was constantly doing this because his wish was that one day they would ride into town with David's body draped over his horse. He was being used. Can I tell you, one of the worst things that you can realize that is going on in your life is when somebody you trusted is using you. Where somebody is trusting you is trying to have their own way and get their own benefits out of your life. It devalues you. It makes you feel like nothing. But David continued to allow. He was using David on the battlefield. He's used David to soothe the spirits that was attacking him. He even used his daughter to get to David and to try to become a snare to David. That was why he lost his trust. First of all, because he was being used. Secondly, he was being manipulated. Saul was a master manipulator. Have you noticed that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Saul knew how to pull strings. Saul knew how to set up scenarios. Saul knew what the dowry would mean to David. Saul knew, how to put him in the most dangerous situations, the most dangerous circumstances. You're going to see this manipulation again and again. Saul would manipulate his servants to get to David. Tell him this. Say this to him. Find out this about him. Then come to me and tell me. He was manipulating. David in your life. Yet another thing that is awful for us to experience in our life is to be manipulated. When somebody begins to pull the strings. Another way he manipulated him is he had days that would expire. By law, David had earned a wife. That was the criteria. Take down Goliath, and you get a wife, and you get tax-free for life. Now, there's a dowry. And not only is there a dowry, but now there is an expiration date on that dowry. You know, you gotta bring me proof of 100 kills in the short period of time so that I can know that is taking place. Al, do you?
I was going to say, when David killed Goliath, they, for at least a period of time, eliminated the one common enemy that they always had to worry about. That was the Philistines. Saul apparently didn't realize that he became elevated when that happened. And that made him quite, you might say, the well-known nation around that area. It would almost imagine that.
By the matter of his position,
Right.
he would receive glory, but he wasn't getting the credit.
Yeah,
That's what.
Even though he didn't kill Goliath.
That's right.
One of his soldiers did.
Yes, absolutely. And it gave Israel an advantage. As we can see, they're still fighting against the Philistines. But the Philistines are on the defensive. The Philistines are on the run. They're trying. But you see, because David had been used, David had been manipulated. But something Al mentioned earlier that is very pertinent here. David was blessed anyway.
Yeah, he was. Yeah.
Yes, blessed anyway. God would bless him on the battlefield. God would bless him with the dowry. God would bless him in time and time again. And can I tell you, when you're losing stuff in your life, it's easy to overlook the blessings. When you're being stripped of this, it's hard to see God has really supplied my need. God is blessing me. But David would come to realize and recognize that in the middle of everything that I've gone through, in the middle of my loss, in the middle of those things, Lord, you are still my strong tower. You are still my source and supply. We've got to understand that. We've got to understand that in the middle of our loss, in the middle of people using us, in the middle of people manipulating us, God still has his hand on us. And I like the fact that David played the long game. David realized that God would come through for him in the long run. David understood that God would deal with Saul. David understood that he would sit. I believe he understood that he sat on the throne, although he probably didn't ever talk about it. Probably didn't ever promote it in his life. And it might have been because he didn't know when. He didn't want to bring it up and bring confusion into his life. You see, we need to understand that David played the long game. There's a tribe in Africa that they discovered, and they noticed something about this tribe right away. The king was filthy rich. Anything he wanted, he just nodded, said, and he had. The king had absolute power. Everything he said was law. Everything he said was, if he said that person dies, no questions asked. He had absolute power. But they stuck around long enough to find out something. Every 7 years, they got a new king. After 7 years on the throne, the current king was executed. And a new king was crowned for 7 more years. And you know what the shocking thing is? They had a long line of people wanting to be king. For 7 years of riches, for 7 years of their word being, for 7 years, for that short period of time, would you do it? Would you sign up to have everything you wanted for 7 years and then die? I believe so many of those men, they enjoyed it while they had it, but then when that 7th year rolled around, wait a minute, guys, I don't know about this. Why? Because that is the culture that we live in. I want it now. I want my riches. I want my, I'll be on credit till the day I die. They will say, I just want all that I want today. And the problem is with that is that you don't let God do that because God is in no hurry. God, his timing is what David would grab a hold of. He understood something. No matter how people treat me, no matter what happens to me, God is shaping a king within me. And no matter how much I lose, I am still blessed. That was the attitude of King David. And then finally, he lost peace. Now, I'm not talking about internal peace. I'm not talking about spiritual peace. I'm talking about external peace. David's life was about to be turned upside down. Chaos was going to ensue. Things were about to change instantly and immediately. How many of you know believers, and you don't have to raise your hand, that God's given them peace, but they are quick to surrender it as soon as something comes up? As soon as their life gets a bit chaotic, as soon as things get shaken up, as soon as the first sign that they're going to lose something, they lose their peace. We can lose peace around us and not lose peace within us. Notice what the Bible says in verse 28. Thus Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. But listen to his response. And Saul was still more afraid of David, so Saul became David's enemy continually. Saul set out to make David's life a nightmare. Saul set out for the annihilation of King David. Saul set out that his main purpose, you hear a lot about David going out to battle. You don't hear a lot about Saul going out to battle, do you? Huh? Saul had a purpose in his mind. His purpose was the annihilation of King David. It was the killing of King David. It was the ruining of the life of King David. We have something in common with King David. We have an enemy that wants to do us harm. And the way the enemy wants to do that is the enemy is out. Well, I got two of them. The enemy is after your peace. The enemy is after to strip that away from you and your life. If he can do anything in your life, Jesus said, put it this way: my peace I give to you. Not as the others give, but my peace I give to you. So how do we lose our peace in here? We surrender it. We give it up in the middle of our situations and circumstances. We don't have to do that. I'm glad David didn't do that. David didn't allow the chaos that was surrounding him to get within him. David didn't allow all those things to take place in his life to string him along. Can I warn you that if the enemy finds out there's an area of your life that he can steal your peace, that area will be on fire all the time. That area will be chaotic all the time. It's in those times that we learn, in the middle of our situations and circumstances, where peace is lost around us, peace can be found within us. David would write some of the most powerful psalms in the cave of Adullam. Why? Because he come to realize that the enemy was after his peace, but he would not surrender it at all. Jesus gave. The old timers used to say this, and I love this phrase. The world didn't give it to me, and the world can't take it away. And when it comes to our peace, that needs to be our claim. Satan, you didn't give it to me. You can't take it away. My situations and circumstances. If your peace relies on the situations and the circumstances that surround you, you will never have peace. If your situation is in the times in that you live, and that your peace is gone in the middle of that, you'll never have peace. It's time for us to lay claim to the peace that Jesus has given us, and to declare, I will have peace. I will have peace with Jesus. I believe Jesus will teach us that. And then finally, I love this phrase. David behaved more wisely. Listen to what it said in the close of this. Then the princes of the Philistines went out to war, and so it was, whenever they went out, that David behaved more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name became highly esteemed. I love that phrase. David behaved more wisely. What does that tell me? First of all, it tells me that David wasn't relying on feeling. It wasn't an emotional thing for David. It was a wise thing for David. When David didn't understand it, he kept doing what God had told him to do. He kept serving the way God had told him to serve. You see, wisdom doesn't rely on my gut feeling. Wisdom doesn't rely on how things look or how things feel. Wisdom relies on what I know, and then what's the second part to wisdom? Well, there's the fear of God. That's right. There's fear of God. But what's the second part of wisdom? What is wisdom? Wisdom is not just knowledge. It's what? How?
It's how to use it.
How to use it. That's right. So David's understanding of God and what God wanted and what he applied to his life, it changed his behavior. It changed his walk. It changed the way he walked in wisdom, because he walked in the Word of God. He walked in the will of God. I've always said this way: if we really believe what we say we believe, our lives would be radically different. Because why? Because we can walk in confidence, we can walk in trust, we can walk in faith in God, we can walk in what God has for us. We can behave more wisely. I like that it said he behaved. You know, anybody you raised and your mama say, you better behave. Well, I knew what that meant. That means you got to walk properly. You got to do what is right in the face of everything else. When you want to, you behave. When you don't want to, you behave. David behaved more wisely. So in the middle of our testing of loss, we've got some firm foundations to hang on to. In the middle of everything that might be stripped away from us, some of the most powerful Christians I've ever been blessed to know had suffered the greatest loss in their life. But it didn't make them bitter. It made them better. It transformed their hearts and their lives. God wants you to know He will sometimes bring loss to our lives to expose our hearts, to shape our lives, and to change us into the image that He has for our life. So we appreciate you coming out tonight. And we're so glad to see many of you back. Come back and be with us Sunday. God bless you.